January 1943. The English winter wrapped RAF Halesworth in sleet and iron skies. Out on the muddy hardstands sat shapes that seemed to mock every European idea of what a fighter should be. The Republic P-47. Thunderbolt did not glide into its war. It squatted, barrel fuselage, greenhouse canopy, wings stubby for its bulk, and a four-bladed propeller so huge it looked like farm machinery. Pilots arriving from America stared and asked the same question. This thing actually flies? The 56th Fighter Group had crossed the Atlantic with no illusions. The 8th Air Force's daylight bomber offensive was being chewed apart by the Luftwaffe. Flying fortresses needed guardians if they were to reach Bremen, Hamburg and Berlin and come back with crews alive. Spitfires were agile but short-legged. Mustangs had not yet arrived in strength. The burden fell on a fighter that looked more like a small bomber itself, the P-47. Into this crucible walked a commander as hard as the Suffolk wind. Hubert Hub Zemke, Montana-born, West Point trained, sharp in the jaw and sharper in the eye. He had flown with the Soviets as an observer, studied Luftwaffe tactics up close, and believed in discipline more than charisma. He saw at once what the 56th needed, not swagger, not folklore. Method, data, a fighting system. He drilled the group mercilessly. Formation flying became geometry, not guesswork. Briefings turned into classrooms where altitude bands, fuel burn and cloud decks were plotted with chalk like equations. Debriefings were interrogations. Every pilot answered the same questions. What did you see? At what altitude? What heading? What colour was the spinner? Zemke turned impressions into patterns, patterns into doctrine. The nickname came without ceremony. Pilots began saying they hunted like wolves, spread, sniffing for weakness, converging with a kill's inevitability. Soon everyone was calling them Zemke's Wolfpack. But first, the pack had to survive its own mount. The P-47 could dive faster than any fighter in Europe, true, but it also killed the careless. Torque rolls on takeoff snapped more than one Thunderbolt into the ground. Ground loops destroyed others, and in dives past 30,000 feet, the stick froze as compressibility took hold. More than one pilot learned what it meant to ride a falling anvil. By spring 1943, the 56th had buried men without ever seeing an enemy cross. And yet the aircraft had secrets waiting to be unlocked. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, fed by a massive turbo-supercharger, delivered sea-level power at 27,000 feet, where German Daimler-Benz engines gasped thin air. The radial shrugged off punishment. No coolant system meant no single bullet could drain life from it. A P-47 could fly home with oil on the windshield, holes stitched across the fuselage, and still thump onto English soil with its pilot alive. Zemke understood what that meant. Survivability wasn't just comfort, it was time. Time to learn, time to refine tactics, time to turn rookies into killers. Where the Luftwaffe bled irreplaceable veterans, Zemke's men could return, study their mistakes, and be sharper tomorrow. The first blood came in June 1943. Over Belgium, a Wolfpack patrol intercepted Focke-Wulf 190s rising to strike bombers. The fight was fast, vertical, violent. A German peeled away in flames, the first confirmed kill for the group. In the ready room afterward, men slapped backs, but Zemke was cold. "Don't celebrate one kill," he said. "Celebrate learning how to make it repeatable." Losses followed quickly. A P-47 that failed to roll out of a dive. A wingman who tried to turn with a Messerschmitt and never came back. The Luftwaffe still had the initiative, seasoned aces with years in the cockpit. The Americans were fresh. Every mission was tuition paid in blood. But patterns emerged. The Thunderbolt would not outclimb a 109 at low altitude, nor outturn a 190. But above 25,000 feet, the odds shifted. And in a dive, the big jug was untouchable. Zemke drilled his squadrons. Don't turn, don't climb low, dive, hit hard, get out, live to do it again. In those hard early months, the Wolfpack forged its identity. They were not knights jousting in the clouds. They were hunters, cold and methodical. Their purpose was not to tally pretty duels, but to keep bombers alive, to choke the Luftwaffe's fighter arm until the Reich itself suffocated. At Halesworth, the ground crews came to understand their own role in the creed. Armourers learned to pack belts of 50 caliber ammunition with mixes of armour-piercing incendiary and tracer that produced walls of fire. Mechanics coaxed the R2800s through the cold with oil heaters and prayer. Briefing rooms reeked of wet wool and cigarette smoke, maps scarred by grease pencil arcs that showed where wolves would prowl today. By summer's end, the group had tasted both triumph and grief. The scoreboard was modest, the cost real. But Zemke's Wolfpack was hardening. The Luftwaffe still held the advantage, but something had shifted. High above the North Sea, contrails twisted together and broke apart in sudden violence, and the Germans, who had once laughed at the ungainly American machines, began to file reports that spoke of a new kind of fight. The Wolfpack was learning, and with every mission that returned, it grew teeth. July 1943. RAF Halesworth. The Wolfpack was still raw, still bleeding lessons into the cold English sky. Among the men finding their place was a Polish-American from Oil City, Pennsylvania, with a grin that could charm and a temper that could cut. Francis Gabby Gabreski. Gabby had already tasted war before the 56th. He had flown briefly with the RAF's Eagle squadrons, those units of American volunteers who fought in Spitfires before the US officially entered the war. He had seen the thin Merlin-powered fighters claw at German raids over Britain, and he carried both the pride of that service and the arrogance of a man convinced he belonged in the thick of combat. When he transferred into the US Army Air Forces, his reputation preceded him: skilled, cocky, restless. The 61st Fighter Squadron, one of the three teeth of Zemke's Wolfpack, was where Gabreski landed. The squadron rooms were crowded, noisy, a mix of farm boys, college dropouts, and former barnstormers. Gabreski was older than many, already married, already carrying himself as though destiny owed him a reckoning. He bristled at authority he thought lesser, quarrelled with fellow officers who questioned his bravado, and carried himself with a chip that seemed carved from granite. Zemke, cold-eyed, measured the man carefully. He had no patience for swagger unbacked by results. Gabreski's flying was sharp, aggressive, but it was also impatient. He wanted fights, wanted kills, and in the sky over Germany that eagerness was as dangerous as any Focke-Wulf. Zemke's doctrine demanded hunters who could stalk, strike and return, not hotheads burning fuel for glory. For weeks, Gabreski seemed out of place, the rough edge against Zemke's grinding machine of discipline. The summer raids revealed why the 56th existed. Bomber losses were climbing: Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Bremen. Each mission bled away dozens of crews. B-17s could tighten formations until wings overlapped, but without long-range fighter cover they were slaughtered by coordinated German attacks. The 56th's job was simple to say and near impossible to do: intercept the interceptors, keep the Luftwaffe too busy to butcher the heavies. For Gabreski, the test came in late August 1943. His squadron swept ahead of B-17s bound for the Ruhr. At altitude, contrails split, and the Luftwaffe came. Focke-Wulf 190s climbing from below, Messerschmitt 109s slashing from the sun. The sky dissolved into corkscrews and fire. Gabreski rolled into the fight, and in that maelstrom, instinct met training. He remembered Zemke's words: "Don't turn, don't duel. Hit once and live." A 190 streaked across his nose. Gabreski squeezed the trigger and the 8.5s hammered. Tracers reached out, found metal, and the German disintegrated, wing shearing away, smoke trailing into cloud. It was Gabby's first confirmed kill. He returned to Halesworth flushed, triumphant, the grin wide. On the board his name went up in chalk, the first of what would become the group's leading tally. But the elation carried weight. Others did not return. One pilot failed to pull out of a dive. Another vanished into cloud, never seen again. Every kill seemed counterweighted by loss. For Gabreski, the lesson was bitter. Skill alone did not guarantee survival. Survival came from discipline, from embracing Zemke's hard creed. The Wolfpack's education was accelerated by an event that entered legend. June 26, 1943, Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron. His Thunderbolt was ripped by cannon shells, canopy jammed, controls failing. Attacked again and again by a German ace, Johnson's P-47 absorbed punishment beyond comprehension. Holes stitched through the fuselage, hydraulic fluid spraying, structure cracked, but still it flew. Johnson returned to England in a wreck that should not have flown at all. His survival stunned the group and the Luftwaffe. For Gabreski and for every man at Halesworth, the lesson was indelible. The jug was not graceful, but it was immortal. You could make mistakes, take hits, and still come back. That meant experience could accumulate, meant lessons weren't always written in funerals. It changed the psychology of combat. Where Luftwaffe pilots risked their irreplaceable veterans, the Wolfpack was building killers who grew sharper with every sortie. Through the autumn of 1943, the tempo increased. Raids went deeper, bombers pushing into Germany's industrial arteries. The 56th flew escort after escort, high cover over contrails stretching like chalk across the cold stratosphere. German tactics adapted, mass slashing attacks, head-on passes that filled the windscreen with cannon fire. But the Wolfpack learned too. They hunted at altitude, dived with disciplined fury, and then zoomed back upward before the Luftwaffe could recover. Gabreski thrived in this new environment. He found rhythm in the Wolfpack's doctrine: use altitude as a shield, speed as a sword, discipline as survival. By September, he was not just scoring kills, but teaching others how to think like hunters. Zemke noticed. The rough arrogance remained, but it was tempered by purpose. The Wolfpack didn't need lone wolves, it needed leaders. And Gabby, for all his edges, was proving one. His confidence sometimes grated. He mocked Spitfires as toys, dismissed British tacticians, and quarrelled with peers over credit. But in the cockpit, his results silenced doubters. Kill after kill chalked onto the board. A wingman's trust hardened. When Gabby led a flight, men knew they had a chance to strike and come home. The autumn skies grew deadlier. German units fought with desperation. New Focke-Wulf 190 variants, armoured to tackle bombers, appeared. Twin-engine Zerstörer heavy fighters hurled rockets into formations. The Wolfpack was blooded daily. But the tide, imperceptibly at first, was shifting. By November 1943, Zemke's hunters had claimed hundreds of victories. More importantly, bomber losses began to ease when Thunderbolts prowled above. German pilots filed reports of the big American fighters diving from impossible altitudes, hammering with firepower that shredded wings and engines in seconds. The laughter that had once greeted the flying milk bottles was gone. In the mess halls at Halesworth, the Wolfpack talked less of survival and more of hunting. The tone was changing. Pilots no longer asked, "Will we live?" but "How many will we take?" And at the centre of that new confidence was Gabreski. His kills mounted, his reputation grew. He was becoming not just the best shot in the squadron, but the face of the pack itself. Yet even in triumph, the hard lessons endured. Every empty chair at breakfast was reminder enough. Gabreski's education was not finished, but by the close of 1943, he had learned the creed Zemke demanded: fight at altitude, strike with cold precision, and live to fight again. The Wolfpack had teeth now, and Gabby's were the sharpest of all. December 1943. Over the Ems River Valley, a grey dawn split by contrails. In the gun sight of a P-47 Thunderbolt, the Luftwaffe's illusion of superiority began to unravel. 8 half-inch answers at a time. The Republic-built fighter had always looked too heavy, too blunt, too American. But beneath its barrel fuselage lay the most concentrated gunnery package yet carried by a single-engine fighter. 8 Browning AN/M 2.50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, each firing at 750 rounds per minute. When synchronized, those guns produced a river of fire. Nearly 100 rounds per second, every slug a half-inch in diameter, each capable of tearing through aluminum, hydraulic lines, fuel tanks, or flesh. German pilots had dismissed machine guns as obsolete compared to their 20 and 30 millimeter cannons. But the Americans had solved the lethality equation differently, not through caliber, but through volume, range, and reliability. A Messerschmitt 109 might carry 200 cannon shells total. A Focke-Wulf 190 might add wing guns with 120 rounds apiece. A Thunderbolt took off with 3,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. That meant a pilot could hold the trigger for 30 seconds of sustained fire, 3 to 5 times longer than any Luftwaffe opponent. The pack learned fast. At Halesworth, gunnery officers drilled convergences into doctrine. Each pilot set his gun sight harmonization to personal preference. Most chose between 250 and 350 yards, the range at which the 8 ballistic streams crossed into a killing zone 6 feet across. At that distance, a German fighter caught in the funnel was shredded in less than 2 seconds. Gun camera film, reviewed nightly in the operations huts, became textbooks of destruction. One reel showed Gabreski himself pulling lead on a diving Focke-Wulf. At 300 yards, his tracers walked across the wing route. The German fighter exploded in a white flash, pieces fluttering down like confetti. "Stop the reel," officers would say. "Count the frames, 0.2 of a second on target." That's all it took. "Point, fire, kill," Zemke told his men. "Don't waste motion. Don't waste ammunition. Make the burst count. The film doesn't lie." The gunnery reviews were ruthless. Pilots who sprayed wildly were called out. Those who conserved fire and struck surgically were praised. In the Wolfpack, gunnery wasn't instinct, it was science. By January 1944, escort missions had evolved into counter-air sweeps. No longer content merely to shield the bombers, Zemke's hunters sought out the hunters. The strategy was simple: clear the skies by killing the killers. The Luftwaffe sent up veteran Gruppen, seasoned men who had survived the Eastern Front. Against them came American kids with fewer hours, but with Thunderbolts built like tanks and guns that spat rivers of fire. On one mission over Brunswick, Lieutenant Eugene O'Neill of the 62nd Squadron described the moment it clicked. A gaggle of Focke-Wulfs climbed hard for the B-17 boxes. O'Neill rolled inverted, dove from 28,000 feet, and lined up on the tail of one. "I gave him a 1-second burst," his report read. "Tail assembly detached cleanly. The aircraft fell apart. The 56th was discovering the truth. Dogfighting in the horizontal plane was suicide against lighter German fighters. But in the vertical, with altitude and speed on their side, Thunderbolts were executioners. Their dives were unstoppable, their climb back into the sun uncatchable." The lethality of 8 Brownings came to full expression on February 20th, 1944, part of Big Week, the coordinated hammer blow against Germany's aircraft industry. That morning, Captain Walker Bud Mahurin of the 63rd Squadron claimed 5 kills in a single mission. Gun camera footage showed why. Mahurin's Thunderbolt dove on a formation of Messerschmitt 110 twin-engine destroyers lining up on bombers. His first burst snapped the wing from one, the second cut the tail off another. He rolled through, fired again, and a third exploded mid-air. By the time he climbed away, 5 Germans were burning in the snow below. "Everything hit," Mahurin recalled later. It wasn't marksmanship. It was the weight of fire. You put 8.5s on a target, something's going to break. For the Luftwaffe, the reports were grim. American fighters possess excessive firepower, one German interrogation summary noted. Aircraft destroyed in seconds with minimal exposure. At Halesworth, the pack institutionalized the lessons. Film reviews became mandatory after every sortie. In darkened rooms, pilots watched their own gunnery projected frame by frame. Missed bursts meant embarrassment. Hits meant applause. Zemke pushed data into everything: ranges, angles, burst lengths. "If you can't kill them on film, you won't kill them in the air," he barked. The results were tangible. Kill ratios climbed. Bomber losses dipped when the Wolfpack covered the box. The Luftwaffe began avoiding direct engagement when Thunderbolts were overhead. By spring 1944, the Wolfpack had abandoned turning fights entirely. "Never fight a Hun on his terms," Zemke repeated like scripture. Instead, flights of Thunderbolts patrolled at 28,000 feet, stacked in layers. When German formations appeared, the P-47s tipped over and fell like Thunderbolts indeed. The Germans looked up into a storm of tracers, their formations torn apart before they could react. The pack called it Boom and Zoom. German survivors called it Der Hammer aus der Sonne, the hammer from the sun. One interrogation report captured the terror. A downed Focke-Wulf pilot told his captors, "They dive like meteors. You cannot evade. The sky fills with bullets. One hit and your machine is gone. They are not fighters. They are flying artillery." By April 1944, Gabreski had 15 victories. His confidence was no longer arrogance, it was authority. He preached the new doctrine relentlessly. "Don't chase them in the weeds," he told younger pilots. "Climb high, wait, and when you dive, hold the trigger steady. The jug will do the rest." The Wolfpack was now a pack in truth. Coordinated, disciplined, lethal. Losses still came, but survival odds were rising. For every pilot who fell, 3 more returned with kills confirmed on film. The 8 Brownings had done more than kill Germans. They had changed psychology. Luftwaffe pilots who once jeered at flying milk bottles now dreaded the sight of a P-47's broad wings glinting in the sun. Each burst of fire was an answer to their dwindling Reich. The Wolfpack entered 1944 no longer learning, but teaching. They taught the bombers how it felt to have real protection. They taught the Luftwaffe that no altitude was safe. And they taught themselves that air combat was not about aerobatics or duels. It was about bringing maximum firepower to bear in the shortest time possible. 8 half-inch answers, 3,400 rounds. A mathematics of destruction that no German engineer had accounted for. The Wolfpack had found its voice, and it spoke in the staccato thunder of Browning machine guns. May 12, 1944. Above Osnabrück, the contrails of 2 air forces knotted into a lethal geometry. In the cockpit of his P-47D Thunderbolt, Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke watched the formation unfold exactly as he had envisioned it months earlier on a chalkboard back at Halesworth. A bomber stream protected not by handcuffed escorts circling overhead, but by a sweeping arc of fighters, flexible, lethal, impossible to ambush. The Luftwaffe had walked straight into the Zemke fan. The problem had been obvious since the first Thunderbolts arrived in England. American bombers, B-17 and B-24s, were dying by the dozens in daylight raids over Germany. The theory had been airtight: box formations, overlapping defensive fire, tight mutual support. But the Luftwaffe shredded theory with practice. Against massed waves of Bf-109s and Fw-190s, the combat box bled aluminum and men. Early escorts made it worse. Fighter groups were ordered to stay tied directly to bomber formations, orbiting at the same speed, same altitude, same direction. For pilots in high-performance machines, it was like being leashed to a plough horse. "We might as well have been flying target drones," remembered Lieutenant Joe Egan of the 62nd Squadron. Every Hun in the Reich knew where we'd be, how we'd fly, and how slow we'd turn. Zemke, by then the battle-hardened commander of the 56th Fighter Group, studied the problem with a mathematician's eye. He was no theorist in an office. He had flown escort himself, bristled at the restrictions, and seen too many bombers go down despite his men's best efforts. "Close escort shackled initiative," he wrote in his field notes. "We are tied to the bombers, predictable to the enemy, unable to dictate the fight." At Halesworth, in February 1944, Zemke sketched an idea that would change aerial warfare. Fighters would still rendezvous with bombers, but once in position, they would disperse outward in a great fan-shaped arc, extending 20 to 30 miles ahead and to the flanks of the bomber stream. It was not abandonment, it was offence. The escorts became hunters, pushing outward to intercept incoming Luftwaffe formations before they reached the bombers. After the pass, they would wheel back into the fan, reset, and strike again. The geometry created overlapping zones of danger for the Germans. No matter how they approached, American fighters were already there, waiting. Pilots called it Zemke's fan. Critics in the 8th Air Force staff called it reckless. "Too diffuse," one planning officer scoffed. "You'll leave the bombers naked." Zemke countered with data. Bomber losses under close escort remained catastrophic. Losses under the fan could not possibly be worse, and with luck might be far better. The trial came on May 12, 1944. Mission: a deep strike against oil refineries and rail yards near Leipzig. Opposition: Jagdgeschwader 11, led that day by none other than Günther Raul, the third highest scoring ace in history with over 200 victories. At 25,000 feet, Raul's Staffel climbed toward the bomber stream. "The Americans will be tethered to their fortresses," he told his men. "We'll slash in as always, from the sun." But when JG-11 rolled in, the sky exploded. Thunderbolts were everywhere, above, ahead, off the flanks. Zemke's fan had unfolded perfectly, a crescent of fighters 30 miles wide. Raul's first Staffel dove headlong into an ambush. Major Gabi Gabreski led the charge. His gun camera showed the moment his 8 Brownings raked a 109 from spinner to tail. The German exploded in fire. Seconds later, his wingman went down under Lieutenant Fred Christensen's guns. "It was like they never saw us," Christensen recalled. Raul himself pressed into the bombers and was pounced by Zemke's men. Accounts vary. Raul claimed he shot down 2 Thunderbolts before being hit himself, his 109 crippled and forced down. American reports credited Lieutenant Bob Johnson with the damage. Raul was badly injured, his career effectively ended. For the Wolfpack, the results were electrifying. 26 German fighters destroyed for the loss of 8 Thunderbolts. More importantly, the bombers held formation. Losses cut in half compared to previous deep raids. The day was not without pain. Lieutenant Red McCollum of the 63rd never returned, last seen spiralling into the clouds trailing smoke. Captain Jerry Johnson, one of Zemke's best flight leaders, was lost to flak over the target. Their bunks stood empty that night at Halesworth, silent reminders of the cost. But even in grief, lessons were codified. The fan worked, but it demanded discipline. Pilots who strayed too far could not rejoin in time. Coordination between squadrons was critical. The pack tightened procedures, designated fan leaders, strict radio brevity, altitude blocks to prevent mid-air collisions in the sprawling arcs. "We were writing doctrine in the air," Gabreski later said. "Every fight was a laboratory. Zemke gathered the data, made the adjustments, and by the next mission we were sharper." News of the May 12th mission spread quickly. Intelligence summaries highlighted the sharp drop in bomber losses. Gun camera reels showed Luftwaffe formations torn apart before they could close. By June, 8th Air Force Headquarters authorized other groups to experiment with the fan. The 4th and 352nd Fighter Groups adapted the geometry to their P-51 Mustangs, extending the fan even deeper with their longer range. Results were immediate. Bomber crews noticed less German steel in the formations, fewer parachutes drifting down. "The fans are working," one B-17 pilot wrote in his diary. "We can feel the difference. The Huns aren't swarming us like before. The Jugs and Mustangs are killing them first." The Luftwaffe, already strained by fuel shortages and attrition, began bleeding pilots at unsustainable rates. Staffeln went up 12 strong and came home with 6. Replacement pilots barely trained were thrown into the maw of the fan, where American veterans waited with altitude, speed, and overwhelming firepower. Bomber statistics told the story. In late 1943, raids into central Germany often lost 60 to 70 aircraft, 1,000 men gone in a single day. By mid-1944, under the fan, losses dropped to 10 to 15 per raid. Still brutal, but survivable. The difference meant the bomber offensive could continue, hitting oil, rail and aircraft factories until the Reich's infrastructure collapsed. Zemke's fan was not a trick, not a lucky tactic. It was a system, born of analysis, tested in combat and proven in blood. From the chalkboards of Halesworth to the contrails over Osnabrück, the Zemke fan redefined escort doctrine. No longer chained to bomber boxes, American fighters became predators. No longer predictable, they were everywhere at once. For the Luftwaffe, it was a nightmare geometry. Whichever way they turned, the Americans were already there, gun sight centered, 8 Brownings ready to speak. For the men of the 56th, it was vindication. Discipline and data had paid off. The Wolfpack had turned theory into practice, and practice into survival. And for the 8th Air Force, it was salvation. Intact bomber boxes meant bombs on target. Bombs on target meant oil fires in Leipzig, locomotives in flames at Halle, Messerschmitts destroyed before they left their factories. The fan was more than a tactic. It was proof that air superiority could be engineered, not improvised. It was the Wolfpack's greatest legacy. March 1944. In the hangars at Halesworth, ground crews fitted the new Hamilton Standard paddle blade propellers to the familiar Thunderbolts of the 56th Fighter Group. The change was almost comically visible. Massive, broad-chord blades that transformed the sound and the climb rate of the Jug. Pilots joked the aircraft looked like it could chew the clouds. But after Big Week in February, the sustained campaign that smashed the German aircraft industry, the arithmetic of air superiority had shifted, and the Wolfpack was at the sharp end of making sure it stayed that way. From February 20th to 25th, 1944, 8th Air Force sent wave after wave of B-17 and B-24s against German aircraft plants at Regensburg, Leipzig, Gotha, Schweinfurt. The Luftwaffe rose in strength, bleeding itself white in the process. American escort fighters, including Zemke's Thunderbolts, claimed hundreds of enemy aircraft. The cost was terrible. 243 American bombers lost, thousands of airmen killed or captured. But the Luftwaffe suffered what it could not afford, the destruction of irreplaceable pilots and factories. Big Week proved the concept, Zemke wrote later. We could trade aluminum for pilots. They could not. Every bomber lost was tragic. Every German Staffel shattered was decisive. The Wolfpack logged 78 kills that week, their claim tables suddenly filled with names and numbers. Gabreski, Johnson, Christensen, all adding to tallies that climbed almost as fast as their paddle-bladed Jugs. On March 6, 1944, the order came that many had doubted would ever be given: strike Berlin in daylight. The city was deep in Germany, nearly 600 miles from English bases. No mission was more symbolic or more dangerous. Bomber crews called it the Big B. Zemke's Wolfpack launched before dawn, external tanks slung under wings and fuselage. The new 150-gallon drop tanks gave the P-47 the legs it had long lacked. Crews marvelled at the sight. 69 Thunderbolts filling the morning sky, climbing to 27,000 feet, headed straight for Hitler's capital. For the Luftwaffe, Berlin was sacred ground. More than 500 fighters scrambled to defend it. Over the city, chaos erupted. Gabreski scored his 18th and 19th victories, flame and wreckage marking his path. "We weren't escorting that day," he recalled. "We were hunting." The bombers dropped their loads on railway yards and factories. Losses were heavy, but the message was unmistakable. Berlin could no longer hide. The paddle blade propeller changed everything. Earlier, Thunderbolts had struggled to climb with Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs above 20,000 feet. Now, with the new props, the Jug could claw for altitude with surprising eagerness. Captain Fred Christensen described the difference. "Before, you pulled for the vertical and felt the nose sag. After the paddle blades, you pulled, and she kept going. Suddenly we were dictating fights at 30,000 feet. External tanks solved the other weakness. With wing tanks and a belly tank, the P-47D could now reach deep into Germany, accompany the bombers to Berlin, Leipzig, even as far as Munich. And when combat came, tanks were jettisoned, leaving the Jug with its full 8-gun punch. Unlike the Mustang, which had traded durability for range, the Thunderbolt had lost nothing in the bargain. "We could go long and still fight like hell," said Lieutenant Jerry Johnson. From March through June 1944, the 56th flew escort almost daily. Targets ranged from aircraft plants in central Germany to marshalling yards in France. Each mission followed the same brutal rhythm: pre-dawn briefings, long climbs into contrails, the tense hour of waiting as bombers droned eastward, sudden eruptions of combat when the Luftwaffe struck. The claim tables at Halesworth grew crowded. Gabreski reached 20 victories in April. Johnson and Christensen closed in on ace status. Zemke, ever the tactician, often flew less aggressively, focusing on coordination, but still added to his tally. Losses came too. May 8th, Lieutenant Dave Schilling, one of the group's most brilliant leaders, forced to bail out over France but rescued by the resistance. May 12th, the fan ambush against JG-11 claimed victories, but also cost 2 Thunderbolts lost to flak. "Escort was arithmetic," Zemke told his men. "Each bomber home, each pilot home, each Hun down. That's the equation. Learn it, live it, or you won't last." By June, the results were stark. German fighter strength was crumbling. Pilot quality plummeted as green replacements faced veteran Americans. The Wolfpack's claims reflected the change. In 3 months, they destroyed more than 300 aircraft, cementing their place as the 8th Air Force's top-scoring P-47 group. Their aggressive style, boom and zoom attacks from altitude, gun camera film used to refine aim, relentless discipline, set a standard others followed. The Luftwaffe still fought fiercely. On June 20th, during a raid on Leipzig, Gabreski scored his 24th and 25th victories, but narrowly escaped a collision with flaming wreckage. "It wasn't skill that saved me," he admitted later. "It was luck and a Jug built like a battleship." But the tide was irreversible. The arithmetic of attrition was crushing the Luftwaffe. Where once Staffeln had risen 30 strong, now they came with 12 or 15. Bomber formations that had once been mauled now completed missions with most aircraft intact. Behind every statistic lay human stories: bombardiers who survived to write home, German rookies who never returned from their first mission, Wolfpack pilots who counted kills not with pride, but with weary acceptance. Lieutenant Robert Shorty Rankin described the feeling in a letter home. "You shoot a Hun down, and it's another mark on the board. But you also know that was some kid, maybe 19, shoved into a 109 with barely 50 hours. We don't cheer. We just fly the next mission." For Zemke, the data was proof that doctrine worked. For Gabreski, it was the road to becoming America's top ace in Europe. For the Wolfpack as a whole, it was vindication. that discipline, training, and sheer industrial weight could grind down even the Luftwaffe. Between March and June 1944, the 56th Fighter Group transitioned from promising experiment to decisive instrument of Allied strategy. With paddle blade props, external tanks, and refined tactics, their Thunderbolts finally matched range with punch. The Berlin missions symbolized it best. Where once American bombers had bled uncontested, now they reached the heart of the Reich under a canopy of Thunderbolts. Where once the Luftwaffe had laughed at the milk bottle jug, now they faced its 8.5-inch answers at 400 yards. The arithmetic of air superiority was simple, brutal, and irreversible. Each day, fewer German fighters rose. Each day, more American bombers struck targets that crippled the Reich's war machine. And at the centre of it all, Zemke's Wolfpack wrote its legacy in contrails, in gun camera reels, and in the long lines of victory tallies posted at Halesworth. The arithmetic was no longer in doubt. The Luftwaffe could not afford the equation. Spring 1944 at Halesworth was marked by an intensity that no one mistook for routine. The tempo of the war had accelerated. The Luftwaffe had bled heavily during Big Week, and yet, like wounded animals, the German fighter Gruppen still clawed viciously at the American bomber stream. At the heart of the fight stood Francis Stanley Gabi Gabreski, son of Polish immigrants from Oil City, Pennsylvania, commander of the 61st Fighter Squadron of Zemke's Wolfpack. By the time leaves began to green the hedgerows of Suffolk, Gabreski was no longer simply another ace among many. He was the leader whose name filled mess halls, whose combat reports were read in bomber stations as talismans, and whose growing scorecard made him a living challenge to his peers. This was the season of his peak, where skill, experience, and ferocity converged. When Zemke elevated him to command the 61st Fighter Squadron, Gabreski carried more than his own reputation. The squadron had been forged in the crucible of 1943, learning to fight, to live, and to return alive in their ponderous Thunderbolts. Under Gabreski, discipline hardened into something personal. He was not the easiest commander to serve under. Gabi could be sharp, opinionated, even abrasive. He carried a chip on his shoulder from his early years with the RAF Eagle squadrons, when he had flown Spitfires but failed to score. He had something to prove, both to himself and to others. But the men respected him, because Gabi led from the front. If you wanted to find Gabi in a scrap, one pilot later remembered, you didn't look at the formation. You looked at the thickest clump of Huns, and odds were he was already in there. That spring, a new infusion of energy arrived at Halesworth. The Polish flight experienced veterans of the exiled Polish Air Force. These men had fought over France in 1940, bled in the Battle of Britain, and now brought their ferocious style to the Wolfpack. Gabreski, himself of Polish heritage, embraced them with special zeal. He spoke their language, literally and figuratively, recalled Lieutenant Walter Collier. He pushed them hard, but they responded, and he seemed taller when they were around. Together they gave the 61st a sharpened edge. The Poles had a hunter's instinct, born of exile and revenge. Their partnership with Gabreski was explosive. The record books tell the story with cold clarity. On May 22, 1944, Gabreski claimed 3 FW-190s destroyed over northern France. On June 5th, the day before D-Day, he added 3 more over Évreux. On June 7th, while the beaches of Normandy still boiled with smoke, he downed 2 Bf-10-9s and damaged a third. Each combat report followed a pattern. The jug diving from altitude, the 8 guns spitting incandescent fury, German aircraft crumbling under concentrated fire. Yet behind the statistics was a rhythm only the pilots understood. Boom, climb, roll, dive again. Kill, survive, and repeat. The Poles matched him, sometimes exceeded him. But Gabreski's reputation as the Wolfpack's lodestar grew with each sortie. By mid-June, talk in the ready rooms turned to numbers. Gabby was closing on Don Gentile's record, the darling of the Mustang squadrons, who had finished his tour with 21. Others, Hub Zemke, Bob Johnson, were in the running too. But Gabreski pressed harder. "Every mission was a chance," he wrote later. "Every Hun in the sky was one less to face our bombers tomorrow." His tally accelerated. June 20th, 2 more kills. June 22nd, another pair. By the end of the month, he stood at 26 confirmed victories, surpassing Johnson and drawing close to Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I benchmark of 26. The newspapers in New York and Chicago began printing his name, the Polish-American sun rising to fame in the middle of Europe's skies. On July 5th, the Wolfpack flew escort for B-24s striking rail yards at Dreux. The Luftwaffe rose in desperation, determined to stem the Allied tide pouring through Normandy. Gabreski led the 61st into a maelstrom of 197s and 109. Within minutes, he had destroyed 3 opponents, each confirmed by gun camera film. His tally reached 28 victories, making him the leading American fighter ace in the European theatre. There was no triumphalism, no champagne. In the mess that evening, Gabby seemed subdued. He knew, Zemke recalled, that numbers were shadows. What mattered was how many bombers got home. Still, the newspapers back home hailed him as America's new air hero. But triumph carries temptation. Gabby pressed harder, flew closer, and sometimes lingered too long over targets. He was, by his own admission, addicted to the chase. On July 20th, 1944, the addiction caught him. The Wolfpack was strafing an airfield at Bassenheim, near Koblenz. Gabreski had already destroyed several aircraft on the ground when he spotted another Heinkel parked on the grass. He lined up, strafed, and at the last moment dipped a fraction too low. The propeller blades struck the ground, metal shrieked, the jug lurched forward, skidded, and came to rest in a cloud of dust. Gabby scrambled out, pistol in hand, but the German guards were already converging. His war in the air was over. Gabreski spent the remaining months of the war in Stalag Luft 1. For a man who had lived in the intensity of aerial combat, imprisonment was a cruel sentence. "The waiting was harder than the fighting," he later confessed. His men carried on without him, the Wolfpack continuing to tally victories through the autumn of 1944. But the aura of invincibility had cracked. Even the best could fall to a single misjudgment, a single second pressed too far. When the war in Europe ended, Gabreski's official record stood at 28 confirmed aerial victories and 3 destroyed on the ground, the top American ace in the ETO. Later, flying F-86 Sabres in Korea, he would add 6.5 more jet kills. But the summer of 1944 remained the apex, the months when his name defined the lethal reputation of Zemke's Wolfpack. Pilots remembered not the tally, but the example. "Gabby showed us that the jug could do anything if you fought it right," said Fred Christensen. "He showed us how to hunt like wolves." The crash at Bassenheim was a reminder of the cost of pressing too hard, but the peak he reached before that moment ensured that his legend endured, etched into claim tables, into gun camera reels, into the memory of every bomber crew that saw a jug slide into formation overhead and felt the relief that meant Zemke's Wolfpack was on the prowl. June 6th, 1944. Dawn broke over the English Channel under a sky that belonged utterly to the Allies. The Luftwaffe barely stirred, its diminished Jagdgeschwader scattered, grounded by fuel shortages or pinned by incessant sweeps. The German fighter force that had once darkened the skies over the 8th Air Force's bomber streams was now reduced to fragments. The shield that covered the beaches of Normandy was forged not only by Mustangs, but by the thunder of Republic P-47 Thunderbolts. At Halesworth, the 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, took its place in the Armada. Over 500 Thunderbolts flew cover on June 6th, strafing, diving, and guarding the invasion beaches. The 56th operated as high cover, Patrols stacked over the channel routes, while detachments roved deeper inland, hunting for anything that moved on German roads. Pilots recalled the skies as a layered fortress, Mustangs at long range, Spitfires at lower altitudes, and the Jugs prowling in between. For the Luftwaffe, the shock was not merely Allied numbers, but the utter absence of opportunity. German aircraft that dared cross into the beachhead were met with swarms of Jugs firing walls of .50 caliber tracers. Many never even reached the sand. They fell burning into the surf, the thunderous chatter of Brownings echoing off the cliffs of Normandy. In the days that followed, the Wolfpack shifted from its escort mission to become a hammer of battlefield interdiction. The term Jabo, fighter bomber, was muttered with dread by German ground troops. P-47s carried 1,000-pound bombs under each wing, plus rockets that streaked into convoys like thunderbolts in truth, and always the 8.5-inch machine guns. A 2-second burst was enough to chew through trucks, locomotives, or horse-drawn wagons. Pilots like Fred Christensen and Robert Punchy Powell remembered diving on long grey columns of transport, watching streams of tracers stitch their way down highways. The effect was annihilating. "You'd see the whole column jam up, trucks jackknifing, horses scattering," Powell said. One pass and it was chaos. By July, German commanders admitted that daylight movement in northern France was nearly impossible. The 56th's logbooks showed thousands of sorties destroying locomotives, cutting rail lines, and leaving towns choked with the smoking hulks of vehicles. The Wolfpack's contribution was decisive in the battles that followed. At St. Lo, where American infantry ground forward through hedgerows, P-47s served as the most responsive artillery imaginable. Pilots orbited, waiting for radio calls, then plunged down to drop ordnance within yards of friendly troops. The true climax came in August at the Falaise Pocket. As German armies attempted to retreat eastward, the sky became a slaughterhouse. The 56th joined 9th Air Force Jugs in wave after wave of ground attack sorties. Locomotives, staff cars, tanks, anything that moved was fair game. The road to Chambois became littered with twisted wreckage, entire columns reduced to blackened husks. German survivors called it the corridor of death. Here, the Thunderbolt's toughness proved essential. Many aircraft returned pockmarked with flak holes, controls shot through, but still flyable. Crews patched them with sheet metal, and by dawn they were ready to strike again. By autumn 1944, many 8th Air Force groups had traded their Thunderbolts for sleek, long-legged P-51 Mustangs. The Mustang could chase Luftwaffe fighters to Berlin and beyond, but Zemke resisted conversion. The 56th stayed in the P-47. They knew its strengths: firepower, survivability, diving speed. "We were married to the Jug," Zemke later said. "We knew how to fight it, and it never let us down." This decision set them apart. While others shifted, the Wolfpack doubled down on its heavy, rugged mount, and in so doing kept a unique identity. In September 1944, Hub Zemke received orders to take command of the 479th Fighter Group. His reputation as a disciplinarian and tactician was too valuable to confine to one unit. He left the Wolfpack reluctantly, leaving leadership of the 56th to Colonel David Schilling. Zemke's fate, however, was cruel. On October 30th, 1944, leading a mission in atrocious weather, his formation encountered turbulence near the Zuider See. His aircraft broke apart in the storm. Zemke bailed out, only to land in occupied territory and fall into German captivity. The architect of the Wolfpack spent the final months of the war behind wire. Yet his doctrine lived on. The Zemke fan, the emphasis on vertical tactics, the relentless stress on discipline, all remained baked into the group's DNA. By late 1944, a new danger appeared: jets. The Messerschmitt Me 262 could outrun any piston fighter, climbing and diving at speeds the Jug could never match. Republic Aviation answered with the P-47M. Fitted with water methanol injection and tuned to squeeze every ounce from the double Wasp engine, the M variant could reach 470 miles per hour at altitude, fast enough to at least challenge a jet under the right circumstances. The Wolfpack was one of the few groups to receive the new model. Pilots found that while they couldn't chase a jet outright, they could catch them during takeoff and landing, or by diving from higher altitude. The 8 Brownings, once again, proved the equalizer. One burst could rip a jet to pieces. In early 1945, 56th FG pilots claimed several Me-262s destroyed, among them kills by Fred Christensen and Jerry Johnson. By the winter of 1944–45, the Wolfpack's claim board approached the all-time records. More than 600 confirmed aerial victories, with thousands of locomotives, trucks and tanks destroyed on the ground. The names filled the roll of honour. Gabreski at 28 before his capture, Schilling, Johnson, Christensen, Bostwick. Each mission brought more chalk marks, more stories told over the mess tables at Halesworth. But the numbers alone did not capture the transformation. The 56th had entered England as green pilots struggling to wrestle a heavy fighter. They had emerged as the deadliest P-47 unit in the European theatre, masters of the jug in every role. By the time American forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the Luftwaffe was shattered. Jagdgeschwader flew skeleton staffs. New pilots arrived with barely 30 hours of training. Thunderbolts ranged at will, strafing airfields, hunting trains, and cutting the arteries of the Reich. The distinction between air superiority and air supremacy had been crossed. In 1943, the Wolfpack fought for survival. In 1944, they fought for dominance. By 1945, they owned the sky. Looking back, the men of the 56th understood the arc. "We started as the shield for the bombers," said David Schilling. "By the end, we were the hammer. The Luftwaffe could not contest us, and the Reich's arteries of supply were bled white." The Wolfpack never forgot Zemke's creed: discipline, vertical tactics, survival first. But under Schilling's leadership and through Gabreski's peak, they became more than escorts. They became predators. And in the statistics of 1944–45, columns shattered at Falaise, jets destroyed on their own runways, kill boards filled to the edge, lay the truth. Air superiority had been wrested from Germany. Air supremacy, the absolute denial of the enemy's sky, had been secured by men flying the heaviest, most rugged fighter of the war. The Wolfpack's Thunderbolts roared over Europe until the end, carrying with them the thunderclap sound that German soldiers called Donnerschlag. For those who heard it, it meant death from above. For the Allies, it meant the war was moving inexorably toward victory. May 1945. The guns in Europe fell silent, and the statistics began to be tallied. For the 56th Fighter Group, the end of combat brought a reckoning, not of survival alone, but of achievement. Led across its fighting career by Hubert Zemke, David Schilling, and Gabi Gabreski, the Wolfpack had carved its name into the arithmetic of air war. The truck-like P-47 Thunderbolt they had once been told could not dogfight had carried them into history. The official tallies came from the U.S. Army Air Force's Victory Credits Board. By VE Day, the 56th Fighter Group had claimed over 665 confirmed aerial victories, the highest total of any P-47 group in the 8th Air Force and one of the highest of any fighter group in Europe, period. Its 3 squadrons, the 61st, 62nd and 63rd, had produced more than 40 individual aces, each with at least 5 enemy aircraft destroyed. The price was heavy. Over 200 pilots lost to combat, flak, accidents, or capture. Yet when the ledger was balanced, the kill ratio remained stark. For every jug lost in air combat, the Wolfpack destroyed several German fighters, and beyond the confirmed kills were the ground claims, thousands of locomotives, trucks, armoured vehicles, and horse-drawn wagons destroyed. Maintenance crews logged sortie after sortie, recording racks emptied of bombs, rockets spent, machine guns reloaded with 3,400 rounds apiece. In June 1944 alone, the group flew over 1,500 combat sorties, a pace few Luftwaffe formations could even imagine sustaining. Behind the numbers lay culture, the rituals of briefing rooms, flight lines, and ready tents. Zemke had demanded discipline from the beginning. Pilots remembered his insistence on rigorous pre-mission analysis, altitudes, enemy tactics, fuel consumption, gunnery convergence. He treated aerial combat like a chess match, where knowledge and patience outweighed reckless bravado. Yet within that discipline was camaraderie. The Wolfpack lived up to its name. New pilots were integrated quickly, shown how to handle the heavy P-47, taught to fight vertically, and drilled in the principle that survival was as important as victory. "You don't win wars by dying in a blaze of glory," Zemke told them. "You win by flying tomorrow." Maintenance crews were just as vital. The Thunderbolt was rugged, but ground crews kept them flying despite flak damage, cracked cylinders, and bullet-riddled wings. Pilots remembered rolling back into Halesworth to find armourers already waiting with belts of .50 caliber rounds, crew chiefs with spanners, and ground men with fuel hoses. "We could break a jug in the morning and fly it again by afternoon," one pilot said. That was the Wolfpack's real secret. The Wolfpack learned early not to fight on the Luftwaffe's terms. Zemke's fan dispersal, the vertical ambush, the boom and zoom, all were designed to exploit the jug's diving speed and resilience. German pilots who tried to turn fight found the jugs refusing to play. Instead, they were struck from above, shredded by 8 Brownings, and gone before they could respond. Gun camera film turned into doctrine. The Wolfpack pored over footage in darkened briefing rooms, studying angles, deflection, and burst lengths. They standardized on convergence ranges, often 250 or 300 yards, and trained to fire in controlled 2-second bursts, letting the probability cloud of bullets do its work. It was ruthless efficiency. In interviews decades later, German survivors remembered the feeling of helplessness. "They never turned with us," recalled a former JG-11 pilot. "They came down like hammers, fired, and climbed away." It was not combat as we knew it. It was execution. No two men embodied the Wolfpack's arc more than Zemke and Gabreski. Zemke, the architect, brought discipline and doctrine. Gabreski, the fighter's fighter, brought raw aggression and a nose for kills. Together, they shaped the 56th into something greater than the sum of its squadrons. Gabreski's rise was meteoric. By July 1944, he had become the leading ace in the European theatre with 28 confirmed victories, edging past Britain's top scorers. His capture at Bassenheim after a crash landing was bitter, but his score stood as testament to both his skill and the system that nurtured it. And then there were the legendary afternoons, multi-kill missions that turned pilots into aces in a single sortie. Fred Christensen's 6 kills in one mission on July 7, 1944, remains among the most celebrated feats of American air combat. Christensen himself credited it to the jug's firepower. "I lined them up, fired, and they came apart like paper." After the war, the Wolfpack gathered at reunions, Halesworth in memory, comrades in spirit. Interviews from the 1960s and 1980s capture the tone, part pride, part disbelief at what they had survived. At one reunion, Zemke described walking the old dispersal at Halesworth years later, weeds sprouting through cracked concrete. "You could almost hear the engines again," he said. German veterans, too, spoke of the Wolfpack with reluctant respect. At post-war symposiums, Luftwaffe aces admitted the Thunderbolt had become their nightmare. Adolf Galland, former general of fighters, quipped, "The Americans built a flying beer barrel and turned it into our worst afternoon." 2 sounds defined memory. The first was the chatter of the 8 Brownings, the deep rolling hammerstroke that German pilots called Roosevelt's clavier, Roosevelt's piano. Survivors remembered that once the keys were struck, there was no reprieve. The second was the jug's unique roar. With paddle blade props biting the air, the P-47's radial engine thundered with a bass note that German infantrymen could identify instantly. They called it Donnerschlag, the thunderclap. Veterans decades later recalled freezing at the sound, instinctively diving for cover, knowing that rockets and tracers were seconds away. The Wolfpack's real legacy lay not only in kills, but in what they proved about modern air war. That a fighter as heavy as the P-47 could dominate showed that survivability and firepower mattered as much as agility. That hundreds could be kept flying daily demonstrated the industrial capacity of American logistics. Each jug required 65,000 parts, 2,000 pounds of aluminum and 300 pounds of rubber. Yet Lockheed and Republic turned them out by the thousands. Each pilot had 400 hours of training, hundreds more than his Luftwaffe opponent. Each sortie consumed hundreds of gallons of high-octane fuel that Germany could not hope to match. The Wolfpack was more than a tactical unit. It was proof of a system, factories, training pipelines, maintenance crews, that turned brute force into refined lethality. In April 1943, German pilots had laughed at the Thunderbolt. Pregnant cows, they called them, flying milk bottles. 2 years later, there were no German pilots left to laugh. The 56th Fighter Group ended the war as the highest-scoring P-47 unit of all time, its legacy written not just in numbers, but in doctrine and memory. Zemke's discipline, Gabreski's fire, Schilling's leadership, Johnson's resilience, all coalesced into a record unmatched. At the Air Force Museum in Dayton, a P-47D of the 56th sits restored, its nose art gaudy, its 8 guns silent. Beside it, a strip of gun camera film plays on loop, showing a Focke-Wulf 190 shattering under converging tracers. The caption quotes an unnamed German pilot, "We laughed when we first saw them. We stopped laughing when they pointed those guns. Then our comrades were gone, and the laughter was gone with them." The Wolfpack's story ended not in laughter, but in thunder.